Good morning and welcome. My name is Tim Caspar. I work at Hillsdale College, where I serve as Associate Vice President for External Affairs and Deputy Editor of Imprimis. I also have the privilege of teaching in the Politics Department. I'm also a graduate of the college, 1994, which is 21 years ago in May, starting to seem like a long time ago. Mulling over themes like the passage of time and advancing age reminded me of one of my political heroes who Charles Krauthammer mentioned last night, Ronald Reagan. Reagan was constantly fending off concerns about his age with grace and humor. During the 1980 campaign, when the issue came up again in 1984, he made a point of saying famously during a debate with Walter Mondale, "I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I'm not going to exploit for political purposes my opponent's youth and inexperience." Well, again, welcome. I'll be your MC today. Welcome to this National Leadership Seminar on Churchill's True Greatness, Lessons for Today. Before introducing our first speaker, I'd like to point out that the college has a literature table set up out in the hallway. You can find information out there about many college programs on and off campus. You can also find copies of Imprimis, the college's national speech digest. I'm happy to report that the monthly circulation of Imprimis has grown from a few thousand in 1972 when it began to over 2.9 million today. And we have our sights set on 3 million. Our first speaker today is Barry Singer. Mr. Singer is the proprietor of Chartwell Booksellers in New York City, the only standing bookshop in the world devoted to the writings of Winston Churchill. As a bookseller, he has handled first editions of all 42 books that Winston Churchill published in his lifetime. I made a point to ask him at dinner last night if the number 42 is correct. He assured me Richard Langworth would agree. He has also handled many of the most significant Churchill rarities to come to light over the past 3 decades, including a long-lost handwritten manuscript for a work of fiction, a short story entitled On the Flank of the Army. Mr. Singer writes extensively on the arts for numerous newspapers and magazines, and he is the author of several books on the subject, including Alive at the Village Vanguard, which won an ASCAP Deems Taylor Award for Excellence in Music Writing. His latest book, Churchill's Style, The Art of Being Winston Churchill, is his first on the subject of Winston Churchill. The book's theme, as he writes in his introduction, is, quote, the artistry he employed in constructing his day-to-day life, unquote. This theme is the subject of his presentation today. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Barry Singer.
Good morning. Thank you very much for coming out so early to listen to me talk to you about Winston Churchill in the morning. I'm delighted to be here. Winston Churchill would not have been. Winston Churchill was not a morning person. He worked at night. He worked until very late into the night, usually dictating his speeches, his books, his magazine articles to a rotating retinue of very dizzy secretaries who tried to keep up with him. He went to bed late, and he didn't rise until probably around this time, if not a little later. When he did, he was brought the morning papers, every one of them, on this. This is one of many bed trays that Winston Churchill employed throughout his life. I found it in the attic at Chartwell. They would bring him the papers, and they would bring him an enormous hot breakfast. I hope you had a breakfast this morning remotely as large as the ones that Winston Churchill consumed every morning. One of his pre-war secretaries, a lady by the name of Phyllis Moir, once described watching Churchill in the morning, quote, in his old-fashioned four-poster bed, the Peter Pan of British politics, her words, sitting up, tufts of red hair standing up from his head, scanning closely the morning newspapers with a cigar in his mouth. It can seem as though Winston Churchill emerged on the world stage during World War II, more or less conjured by central casting in full costume. The hat, the bow tie, the overcoat, the cigar, the V sign. very theatrical. In fact, Winston Churchill spent a lifetime preparing for this role. The character and the creation were all his, the consummation of a 65-year evolution. As the proprietor of Chartwell Booksellers, my tiny Churchill-centric bookshop in New York City, I have for 32 years now been immersed in all things Churchill. I've handled and at least fleetingly read everything that he wrote, and just about everything that was written about him. And all that time, it never occurred to me that I really might have anything to add to the voluminous amount that has been written about Winston Churchill, until one day it occurred to me that I did. Churchill's style, the art of being Winston Churchill, which fascinated me. The more I learned about him, and I do still learn something new about him just about every day, the more fascinated I became with the singular manner in which he lived his life away from politics. His lifestyle, I believe, was cunningly constructed, it was no accident, to nurture him and to sustain him in a way that I can only describe as holistic. Yes, Mr. Churchill was easily satisfied with the best. As his friend F.E. Smith once said about him, this was a quote that came to be attached to Winston Churchill, but it was the first Lord Birkenhead, his close friend F.E. Smith, who said it about him. This does not in any way dismiss the quotation. It was true. But the elements of Churchill's style seem to me to constitute a great deal more than merely a lavish leisure life. One quote from all the endlessly quotable things that Winston Churchill did in fact say, stands out for me. As one's fortunes are reduced, one's spirit must expand to fill the void. He wrote these words in a letter to his wife Clementine in 1915 from the trenches in France, where he'd volunteered to serve after being ousted as First Lord of the Admiralty over the disaster at Gallipoli, for which I believe he was unfairly scapegoated. Imagine, as one's fortunes are reduced, one's spirit must expand to fill the void from the trenches on the Western Front. I think it is a magnificent maxim to live one's life by, and Churchill did. Now, by my count, he lost at least 5 elections in his terribly bumpy political career. Each time that he was driven from office, Churchill found something new in his private life to embrace that nurtured him, and I believe rejuvenated him for the next public battle. After his resignation as First Lord, in the teeth of World War I, he discovered painting as a pastime. This is one of his palettes, also buried in the attic at Chartwell. For the rest of his life, he painted as a respite from the world of politics. I just want to point out here also, when I first saw this picture of him, this was a cartoon that ran in Punch in the 1920s, I thought that was a bottle of wine or whiskey that was next to him, which would have been appropriate, although I don't think Churchill would have actually painted with a bottle next to him. But if you look closely, it says turpentine. After the tragic death of Winston Churchill's 2-year-old daughter from illness in 1921, he bought Chartwell. This is how it looked when he first saw it. A rather ramshackle old country house in Kent that Clementine Churchill was desperately convinced would ruin them. Churchill redesigned it and slowly rebuilt it, very much with his own hands, turning it into an oasis that he retreated to for the rest of his life. He cultivated roses and butterflies at Chartwell with the intensity of a full-time naturalist. He became so adept at bricklaying that he actually joined the Bricklayers Guild. They were not actually that happy to have him. He was a staunch anti-laborite, and I don't believe he ever attended a meeting. But he did get his guild card, I've seen it. Churchill played polo competitively until he was 52 years old. He rode horses into his 80s. Bear in mind, as a young subaltern, he was a cavalry officer. He built a horse racing stable that enjoyed great success on the track in the 1950s, much of it after his retirement as prime minister. I adore that picture. I think it's just beautiful. That's taken at Chartwell. He also smoked and drank. Did you know? Well, he did. He was a cigar epicure and a champagne aficionado whose greatest passions were Cuban cigars and Paul Roget's champagne. He kept his cigars in a small room on the second floor at Chartwell between his bedroom and his study in boxes marked, you can't make this stuff up, wrapped, naked, and large, for identification purposes. Though he received cigar cutters as gifts, he did not use them. Churchill preferred to gash his cigars at the tip in a small V shape appropriately, or he would pierce the cigar with a large match and then blow through to create a passage. Paul Roget was Winston Churchill's parents' favorite champagne. He inherited the preference, and then, like so much else in his life, he bettered them. He bought staggering quantities of Paul Roget from the family wine merchant Randolph Payne and Sons at 61 St. James's Street. This is just one, and an early one at that, of a massive number of invoices that have been preserved at the Churchill Archives at Churchill College, Cambridge. It was a delight to run through them, but also rather frightening. He would buy up whole vintages. And after a lifetime of drinking Paul Roget, Churchill finally met Madame Odette Paul Roget, the doyenne of the champagne-making family, at a British Embassy Armistice Day party in Paris in 1944. He would later say that he was as captivated by Madame Odette Paul Roget's elegance and beauty as he was by the champagne served at lunch that day. Paul Roget 1928, which was his favorite vintage. Churchill instructed the British ambassador, Alfred Duff Cooper, to invite Madame Paul Roget to the embassy every time Churchill was in Paris. Over the ensuing years, he would dine with her at Buckingham Palace. He would host her at Chartwell and at number 10 Downing Street. And he visited her at the Paul Roget Chateau at Epernay, which Churchill called the world's most drinkable address. He even named one of his racehorses after her, and one of her champagne vintages after him. An interesting point to make about Winston Churchill is that he very much enjoyed the company of beautiful and intelligent women. He loved to bring them to his table. He kept many, many close correspondences, even with old flames who had rejected him when he'd proposed marriage to them as a youth, but maintained these very, very close friendships. Yet, as far as I can tell, and any other researcher or biographer can tell, Winston Churchill never strayed from his marriage. Probably unique in the annals of British politics. He appears to have had no mistresses, but he did have close friends. He enjoyed the company of women who had something to say. His favorite whiskey was Johnny Walker Black Label or Red. Heen was his favorite cognac. It's interesting to note that although he was a champagne aficionado, according to Christopher Soames, his son-in-law, he didn't particularly care about the caliber of cognac that he drank. And at Chartwell, Soames often decanted into this. I couldn't believe it, I found this decanter at Chartwell. The excellent vintages of cognac that Churchill was presented with by admirers, and replaced them with lesser quality cognac which Churchill drank and enjoyed. Now I must confess to you, the original subtitle for my book, Churchill's Style, was Living Well Beyond Your Means. It truly was, and I was dissuaded from this by Sir Martin Gilbert, who said, "You can't." However, Winston Churchill had a very hard time holding on to money. His singular gift I believe, was a stalwart ability to live as he wished, even if it was often beyond his means. This was not solely a gift for extravagance, nor did it ever quite ruin him. Churchill simply knew how he wanted to live, and throughout his long life was endlessly resourceful in finding ways to do so. He dressed above all else for comfort, yet he wore bespoke everything. He preferred to slip in and out of his clothes. His dress shoes were made with zippers, not laces, custom made. And after retiring as prime minister in 1955, he practically lived in his monogrammed slippers, these monogrammed slippers, which were, of course, handmade. The supreme example of his zipper-driven fashion sense, however, was the Siren Suit that he himself designed. A zip-up all-in-one that his children referred to as his rompers. Though ideally suited to hurried dressing at the sound of an air raid siren, the Siren Suit was in fact conceived during Churchill's wilderness years in the 1930s in imitation of the boiler suits that the bricklayers wore, who he worked with and admired so much. He, however, had a number of these made up for him by the bespoke tailors Turnbull and Asser in different fabrics for different activities. One in blue, another green, and this burgundy velvet for formal occasions. He wore this with medals. He had a businesslike blue serge, and of course one constructed of smock material for painting. Generously cut with breast pockets and roomier side pockets, pleats to the trousers and fold-over cuffs, these Siren Suits were an apotheosis of simple practicality and fashion and comfort. We see Churchill here demonstrating the Siren Suit to General Eisenhower, who looks fascinated. As who wouldn't be? The cook is going. Winston Churchill wrote to Clementine in March 1935. She sent in her spoon and ladle on her own account. I am very glad. She had the knack to the highest degree of making all food taste the same and not particularly good. I subsist on soup. These come from the kitchens at Chartwell. I think they're very handsome. The Churchills eventually found a wonderful new cook, a woman by the name of Georgina Landemer, who was the wife of Paul Landemer, the head chef at the Ritz. When Churchill returned as First Lord of the Admiralty in 1939, Mrs. Landemer offered her services to the Churchill family. This was an extraordinary gesture on many counts, but particularly because she was the most in-demand catering chef in London for all the finest dinner parties, country house lunches. She was a very, very important chef to the social scene, and she was giving up an enormous amount of money to come work for the Churchills. She took up residency first at Admiralty House and then followed them to number 10 when Churchill became prime minister, working miracles in a tiny basement kitchen at number 10 that was a dangerous war zone. The building was twice hit during the Blitz, direct hits, that almost brought the kitchen down, and there were fatalities in that kitchen. And she worked there throughout the war, never sleeping until the prime minister did, which was a difficult task, and always rising before he did, which was not that difficult. She would cook for the Churchills until her own retirement in 1954, when she wrote this delightful cookbook. Now, for many years I've been saying, truthfully, that I've only seen this cookbook a couple of times. It's very rare, very hard to find, and very charming, and if you see it, you should grab it. But I have recently learned that the Imperial War Museum, I'm delighted to say, is reissuing it in May in a paperback, and you will be able to purchase it either in London or at Chartwell Booksellers, and I recommend it. Churchill's preferences in food. People often ask me this question. And they were fairly constant, as you might imagine. In soup, only clear broths. It must be limpid, he once said. In seafood, oysters and caviar, lobster and dressed crab and scampi, Dover sole and trout. He did eat fish quite a bit, but meats, he ate quite a bit of roast beef, shoulder of lamb, and foie gras. His favorite pudding, Yorkshire, his favorite cheese, Gruyere, and his favorite dessert, yes, chocolate eclairs. Even more than eating, though, Churchill loved to talk around the dinner or luncheon table. Conversation at table, I believe, was his greatest sport and pastime, a means of simultaneously relaxing and sharpening his thinking, of letting down his guard and taking in new information from his guests. This delightful photograph was taken at Chartwell in 1928, literally by someone, a secretary who jumped up from the table and snapped it in a moment. We see Churchill staring straight at us. To his right is the painter Walter Sickert, who was a mentor and a tutor to Churchill. Churchill had a number of great painter mentors who helped him with his painting. To Sickert's right is Clementine Churchill in the hat, Diana Churchill, their eldest daughter, beside her, a very young and quite adorable Randolph Churchill center, and Prof. Lindemann, Frederick Lindemann, sits to Randolph's right, the gentleman with the mustache. He was Churchill's, one of his closest confidants, and his man for all things scientific and technological. Lindemann practically lived at Chartwell and even was given an official post during World War II, and helped Churchill devise a number of the very clever and often intricate technological innovations that I wouldn't say that he designed them, but he certainly would push for them and inspire them in his staff, including the floating bridges that were used, the floating landing pads that were used at the D-Day invasion. Prof. Lindemann was a very important part of that. Beside Prof, sort of glaring askance, looking slightly askance, is Eddie Marsh, who was Churchill's longest lived, in terms of service, private secretary, and a very important man in his life for many years. And beside Eddie Marsh is Diana Midford, who was another one of those beautiful and intelligent women that Churchill just enjoyed having around at table. And next to her is Therese Sickert, Walter Sickert's wife. Churchill believed in face-to-face conversation more than anything else, and the power of his own personal charm. During World War II, his appetite for conversation and social contact with Stalin and Roosevelt helped build the alliances that shaped the outcome of the war really as much as anything that occurred on the battlefields. I love this picture for many reasons. One of them is that the ring that Churchill is wearing, if you look closely, is actually the cigar band from the cigar that he is smoking. Churchill's willingness to travel anywhere to make this social contact throughout the war, despite his health and his advancing years, yielded 3 titanic meetings of the Big Three, as we know. Tehran in 1943, which is pictured here, Yalta in 1945, and the final face-to-face after Roosevelt's death with Harry Truman and Stalin at Potsdam in 1945 as well. Churchill was often accompanied on these travels by his wife Clementine, or even more often by one of his daughters, Mary, or here we see Sarah Churchill being introduced to Franklin Roosevelt, who's clearly charmed. Churchill preferred to fly and was a pilot himself and one of the creators, really, of the RAF. He often took the controls for a short period, usually while the plane was still on the ground. But whether flying or sailing the Atlantic, the perils of these journeys were enormous, with his age and health adding greatly to those dangers. None of the planes that Churchill flew in during World War II were pressurized. Susceptible to pneumonia, he kept close by him a specially constructed oxygen mask that allowed him to take oxygen and smoke a cigar at the same time. In Cairo, as Churchill was about to board a small plane for a flight to inspect the troops at El Alamein, he asked aloud if he could smoke on board. A young RAF officer, very nervously and after much hesitation, volunteered to check whether the auxiliary gas tanks were full. Churchill stopped him. "I enjoy a cigar," he told the young man, "but not at the risk of being incinerated." In August 1929, Winston Churchill embarked on a 3-month tour of the United States and Canada by train to see the country, as he told his good friend, American financier Bernard Baruch, to see the country and meet the leaders of its fortunes. He was accompanied by his son Randolph in the riding boots, down on the left, his brother Jack on our right, and Jack's son Johnny. I'm afraid, and I looked this up with hope, that he never made it to Denver, though he did come close. On September 18, 1929, Churchill received an invitation to dine with the Mile High Club here in Denver. Churchill cabled back a couple of days later that he could not make it. Now, between you and me, Churchill was at that moment in Hollywood, being wined and dined by William Randolph Hearst, Marion Davies, and Louis B. Mayer. This picture was taken on a movie set. That's not New York City. That's just a set. Churchill was given a tour. Churchill adored movies. He watched them throughout the war to relax at Chequers. He wrote screenplays in the 1930s for the Corder brothers to make ends meet. His most promising screenplay, none of them were ever filmed. And in some ways, the Corder brothers were just hiring him to help him out. But these screenplays survive, and he did write one, Andrew, as you must know, about Napoleon. And he tried to convince, while he was in Hollywood at a dinner party, he spent almost the entire night trying to convince Charlie Chaplin to play Napoleon, which seems to me an inspired idea. And in some ways, you have to think that Chaplin took this to heart later on. Well, I said that already. Churchill took a number of transatlantic voyages when he wasn't flying throughout his life. Most of them on Cunard White Star Line ships. In November 1895, weeks before his 21st birthday, he sailed to New York for the very first time on the Cunard Royal Mail steamship Etruria. He did not have a very good time. He didn't enjoy sailing at all, which is kind of ironic when you consider he was First Lord of the Admiralty twice. "I do not contemplate ever taking a sea voyage for pleasure," he wrote to his mother from the ship. "I shall always look upon journeys by sea as necessary evils which have to be undergone to carry out some definite plan." Usually Churchill sailed on either the Queen Elizabeth or the Queen Mary. In March 1946, it was the Queen Elizabeth that he took here to the United States to deliver what would come to be known as his Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri. During the course of that voyage, he agreed at Cunard's request to write a foreword for a war history they hoped to publish of the two queens. They were troop carriers in the war, the largest troop carriers ever seen, which was very dangerous, as you can imagine. They were a big target. Built for the arts of peace and to link the old world with the new, the Queens challenged the fury of Hitlerism in the Battle of the Atlantic. Churchill's foreword began. At a speed never before realized in war, they carried over 1 million to defend the liberties of civilization. To the men who contributed to the success of our operations in the years of peril, and to those who brought these two great ships into existence, the world owes a debt that it will not be easy to, and as you see, Churchill paused here, to change one word in his final draft. The last word, repay. Instead of the world owes a debt that it will not be easy to repay, Churchill rewrote his conclusion to read, the world owes a debt that it will not be easy to measure. I like that word, measure. In terms of Churchill's style, it's what I was after and what I've tried to accomplish, to measure Winston Churchill, not in terms of the debt we all owe him as a historical figure, but rather to measure the man as a man, through the extravagantly artful style with which he lived his life, the Churchill style. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Singer. We now have time for a few questions. Please raise your hand, and one of us will bring a mic to you.
No questions? We covered it. Richard, oh God, that's scary.
Barry, you said you've been rummaging in the attic at Chartwell. When did you do that, and how did you get in?
They didn't know I was there. No, I went and asked them if I could look through the inventories that they had of stuff that wasn't on display. And they didn't even, no one really had looked at them very often before then. And I just marked up these lists, and then they took me up or down, and we just looked for the stuff. And they have a lot of amazing things that they became aware of themselves, I think, just through our rummaging around. And some of that stuff, I think, has now come out. I mean, it's, you know, when they closed up the house, Winston Churchill owned Chartwell his entire life, but ultimately through an arrangement that was worked out with the National Trust, where they basically bought the house from him in the 1950s after he left office as Prime Minister, but allowed him to live there and Clementine to live there till the end of their lives. And when they were finished with Chartwell, it was immediately turned into a museum. So everything is still there. It's I don't know if you've been there. I hardly recommend that you make a journey to Chartwell. I can't imagine that there is another home in the world that has the spirit so palpably present of its inhabitor, Winston Churchill. It's really an amazing place. Rather unpretentious, not a grand country house, and there's a lot of stuff in the attic.
Can you talk a little bit about his standing desk and his writing style in terms of Churchill, and also his love of military uniforms that I've read that he designed himself over and above the Siren Suits?
Well, he did love uniforms, it's true. In some ways, I think he became a soldier just to be able to wear one. He enjoyed wearing them. He was proud of them. His designing of the uniforms, I think he had a hand in it, but I don't think it was a primary design concern. The standing desk is a fascinating thing. The standing desk that is at Chartwell now was a gift that the children and grandchildren presented to Churchill to replace the one that he really spent most of his time working at. Churchill did work standing up, pacing, and dictating. It all came from here, and he was improvising as he wandered. And what was really, the standing desk was a rather short desk, just sat laid up that a local woodmaker had built for Churchill, who lived near Chartwell. It stood on a table, again, very unglamorous. There's now a very beautiful carved one at Chartwell, which Churchill did work at, but most of his writing was at the standing desk. He had these secretaries who were with him throughout the nighttime. You know, he dined late, he prepared himself to work, and then he went to work late. And he just stood at that desk and worked. He corrected proofs at the desk. He did very little, although you see him here actually in this photograph. Well, it's not up right now, but the original photograph that I had up, you do see him sitting at a desk at Chartwell, and he is looking at proofs, and obviously he sat down on occasion. But he did a lot of work, most of his work standing up. I have to defer to them.
You said he did not come to Denver. Did he visit anywhere in Colorado?
No, not that I can tell. He blew right past the state, unfortunately.
What would you say inspired you to go study Churchill?
Well, for 32 years I've been selling Churchill's books. I was always intrigued by the man, but I've learned most of what I know by working with those books over the years. I was not a Churchill scholar when I began. I was simply an admirer. When I opened Chartwell, we named the store Chartwell without necessarily having an intention initially to be a Churchill bookshop. It's not like that was the flash idea. It just became clear to me we wanted a lovely, small, select English library-style bookshop in Midtown Manhattan, sort of an oasis. But in the first year, it became clear to me that with the name, we should have some Churchill books. I brought a few in. I took a very tiny ad out at the back of the New Yorker saying, "Write for our Winston Churchill catalog," which I didn't have, but I was curious to see if anybody would write back. And they did. And it became clear that it was something that I should pursue, which I enjoyed very much pursuing. It couldn't have been a more interesting or a more prolific public figure. And then when I went to London for the first time to start buying for the store, it became clear to me that while every bookshop in London seemed to have a shelf of Winston Churchill, no one was specializing in Churchill. I also have a theory. People ask me, shouldn't there be a Winston Churchill bookshop in London? Why should it be in New York City? In some ways, Churchill is far more popular in the United States than he is in London. We view him from the prism solely of having saved us and the world and Western civilization in World War II, which is a marvelous prism to see him through, and Churchill at his best. But that 65-year career had a lot of he offended a lot of people along the way. He stepped on a lot of feet. He changed parties. I think that there is a consistency, which I will not get into here now, but there is a consistency to Churchill's political positions throughout his life. But the English see him in a much longer view and from a much more wary and slightly dubious view. So Chartwell Booksellers actually belongs in New York. Also, Churchill was half American, very proud of the fact. His mother was born in Brooklyn. His grandfather, Leonard Jerome, owned the New York Times at one point. And he was very proud of the fact that he wasn't just a descendant of the Duke of Marlborough and a tough. He was also an American, which he thought gave him a real sense of independence, which he did have from his class, from class demands. And it's another reason why a lot of his fellow conservative politicians didn't trust him.
I too can identify with Churchill's habit of working at a stand-up desk. I've done that all my life. My question is, did Churchill's paintings have any commercial value, and do they have commercial value today?
They have no commercial value at all today, and if you have any, please bring them to me. And I'll be glad to take them off your hands. Churchill, I don't believe, ever sold a painting. He gave them to his family, and he gave them to friends on occasion as gifts. He painted over 500, close to 550, right? Most of those still are hanging in the painting studio at Chartwell, though they are claimed in some sense. Groups of them belong to different children, and now grandchildren, and then great-grandchildren. They all remain in the family. They are very good. Certainly not all of the same quality, but there is a charm and a vivacity to them, and sometimes they're actually brilliant paintings. He was very good, very prolific. He painted to relax. He loved bright colors more than anything else. They're very appealing. And lately, they have begun to come on the market. And some of the finest paintings, probably that I think we will ever see from that group of Churchill that painted. Lady Mary Soames, when she passed, the family auctioned them in December. I went to London and went to Sotheby's before the auction just to see them. I went down in the basement, and they were just lined up on the wall, and I just wanted to see them before they disappeared. You know, who knew where they were going, who was going to buy them, and where they were going to go. Most of them sold for around $1 million, and one of them sold for $2 million. So they have become extremely valuable and rare.
Mr. Singer, would you be kind enough to tell us a little bit about each of Winston's children and how they were perceived by Winston and Clementine, and how they fit into his life?
That's another book. But in brief, Winston Churchill doted on his children. Some would say to an he overindulged them, particularly Randolph, who he adored and took with him from a very young age. But Churchill was also traveling a lot without his children, so they didn't see him that much. It was a very complicated thing when he would come back home and spend time with them. They were brief bursts. For better or worse, with the exception of the youngest, Mary, they all struggled as adults to varying degrees. Randolph is a case study in the travails of the only son of a great man. Randolph had a lot of gifts. Randolph was, as you can see from some of these pictures, an extraordinarily handsome young man. He wanted to go into politics, but Randolph thought he could do everything immediately. His father had raised him in a way that he just thought, I can follow and better him instantly. I would imagine that to some degree Winston Churchill himself was that sort of a young man when he was coming up. But, and this is a very odd statement to make, but Churchill spoke of it himself, in some ways he was blessed by the fact that his father died young. His father was an enormous political figure and a very, very important and admired and rather loud political figure in London. And because he died young, the world opened up to Winston Churchill for him to become an individual at a very young age and to find himself and to make something of himself, because he also was left very little money. So Churchill didn't suffer in the way his children did by a surfeit of too much attention. So they struggled. They all had, with the exception of Mary, problems with alcohol. Winston Churchill consumed a great deal of alcohol without having it affect him very much, if at all. His children it affected problematically, and they were all, Randolph, Diana, and Sarah were all alcoholics. So they had a very prominent place in his life. I think the best moment for all of them was World War II, individually. Randolph volunteered for the most dangerous espionage missions to prove himself, and did prove himself. Both Sarah and Mary accompanied Churchill again and again on these very dangerous and important journeys, and I think were very close to him and grew very close to him in that. Diana was a very sad situation. She ultimately committed suicide when she was in her 50s, and Churchill was past 80. It was devastating for the family. And Sarah became a very successful actress for a while. I don't know if you've ever seen The Royal Family, but she danced with Fred Astaire and held her own. But her later life was also troubled by alcohol. It was tough, and most people seem to feel, and I believe it's true, that Clementine devoted herself to her husband in a singular way because he was a singular man and needed a lot of attention, but neglected the children as a result. They had to compete with him for her attention. Complicated. Marigold died at 2.5 of septicemia. And both Churchills were away when she became ill. And they had left her with a French nanny, but ultimately Clementine, as any mother would, blamed herself for leaving her with a nurse who wasn't able to deal with the fact that she was ill. By the time they got back, it was too late. a very mild childhood sort of illness suddenly metastasized very quickly, and she was gone. I can't even bring myself to think. I have 2 daughters, what that must have been like for them for the rest of their lives.
Hi, is there anybody in today's political landscape that jumps out at you as being Churchill-esque?
No one even kind of wanders out at me. However, I must say I was fortunate enough to spend time with Boris Johnson, the mayor of London, recently. When his book came out, we had a reception for him at Chartwell, and we had a very interesting evening where he spoke. The man has a great deal of substance. I think he is truly an intellectual, which is I can't think of virtually another politician who you can say that about today. He knows a great deal about Winston Churchill, which endears him to me, but he also fancies himself as Winston Churchill, and whether that endears him to the British public remains to be seen. But he's an interesting fellow, and clownish in a way that I believe is very cleverly conceived. He's the first person that leaps to mind when you ask that question.
You've spoken extensively, mentioning Chartwell and the events there. What role and what events occurred at Blenheim Castle? Wasn't this another of his residences?
It was not one of his residences, and the only major event is that he was born there by accident. His mother was pregnant but not due. She was there for a weekend of parties and riding, and she went into labor. There's a lot to that story. You could write a book about Jenny Churchill going into labor at Blenheim Palace, and whether it was premature, whether it was that Churchill actually was being born full term and that he was conceived out of wedlock. There's a lot of speculation about that. But fundamentally, in the midst of a dance, she went into labor on I think on a Saturday night, and they had to lay her down in a cloakroom, and she gave birth rather unexpectedly to Winston Churchill, who kind of burst upon the world. He grew up there. He did spend a lot of time there. His parents, interestingly enough, were seldom around when he was growing up. They were very busy socially, politically. He was left at Blenheim Palace a lot, a terrific place to grow up. He proposed to his wife Clementine at Blenheim Palace. But it was not a residence. He didn't live there. His father was the non-inheriting son of the Duke of Marlborough. I think the second living son, the third son, but the son between passed away. But he didn't. So Churchill, by a long stretch, was an heir to that title, but never came close.
From Churchill's art to his speeches, his writings, where he lived, what would you say was the theme of his life from your perspective, and then from perhaps Churchill's own perspective?
Well, one of the themes was the richness of the history and the language of the English-speaking peoples. He wrote about that again and again, and probably no one else ever wrote about it so eloquently. I also think that a central tenet of Churchill's life, and it's woven into his writing, is magnanimity. Churchill had a great deal of magnanimity for his enemies. He forgave very quickly once a confrontation was over. And he felt that it was a central tenet of statesmanship. He had no greater enemy in the run-up to World War II than Neville Chamberlain. Yet, when Chamberlain collapsed, when his efforts failed, and when Churchill was designated as his successor, Churchill remained at Admiralty House for a number of weeks to allow Chamberlain to gracefully exit number 10 Downing Street. And then he invited Chamberlain into his cabinet. That was a very central tenet of Churchill's way of viewing the world, that we're all in this together in a sense, that mistakes are made, they must be remedied, they must be addressed, and then they must be forgiven for us to live together. And on that note, let me just say that there were a lot of things thrown around here last night, very brilliantly, by Mr. Krauthammer. But there were a lot of facts that were complicated, more complicated, and some erroneous. I only wanted to correct two regarding Winston Churchill. You should know that his autobiography, his only volume of autobiography, is my early life, not my early years. It's important to remember, so you can come to Chartwell and ask for it. And the other is that when Churchill, and this is an interesting thing just to know, that when Churchill was hit by a car in New York City, he was not hit by a taxi. He stepped out of a taxi cab while looking for the apartment of Bernard Baruch, where he was going for an after-dinner drink, looked the wrong way, and was actually struck by a small truck, which is why he almost died. But it was not a taxi cab. And just those things were hanging around me last night, and I wanted to share them with you, and thank you very much for having me.